I'm the director of the department, and I am also the city engineer. I started working for the city in 1990. And I manage environmental services and building inspections, engineering, and streets and sidewalks, and the stormwater division. And I probably spend at least 50% of my time working on our stormwater efforts in Charleston and drainage projects. You know, Charleston's always had a special relationship with water as a seaport town. And we've got documentation going back as far as 1837, when Mayor Pinckney offered a $100 gold piece to the person that could come up with a plan to solve the drainage problem in Charleston. And nobody ever won the $100 gold piece. But after that time, around the 1880s or so, they built an elaborate system of brick arches that are under Calhoun Street, Meeting Street, King Street, most of the main areas. And they sized them big enough for men to get inside and clean them. They have flat bottoms. And the plan was for them to cut off the tide on either end with gates. And when the tide rose up, they would open the gates and the water would rush in and was supposed to create all kinds of velocity and movement and flush the drains out. And then they would lower the gates again, and when the tide went out, and let it rush out. Well, it was a great idea, but it had difficulties in the engineering of the project, and they've never really worked. And I think it wasn't until 1984 that Charleston completed its first master drainage plan in modern times. And at that time, the plan was adopted by City Council. It was estimated to be about a 20-year plan and $138 million. And in 1990, we started working on the first priority projects downtown and in West Ashley. The first two projects we completed were the Calhoun East Bay project. There's a pump station right down on Concord Street, and then a project over in Ardmore and West Ashley, creating 11 acres of stormwater ponds and making canal improvements and improving the culverts under Highway 17. So that was our really first big effort to deal with the drainage problems in Charleston. And I think it's interesting to point out too, a lot of these problems happened because we filled creek beds in over time. So Lockwood Boulevard wasn't there until 1950. So it became an impedance then for drainage interior to the city. And many of the areas that you see in the city that flood so badly, like Fishburne Street and Wentworth Street, you can literally lay over the old map of the city that shows where the creeks are, and that's where the flooding is the severest. Well, I think some of the projects that we're doing now are going to help us to do that. You know, we're going to have to fortify our edges. So we're working right now to restore the seawall, the low battery seawall. We replaced the corner section of it a couple of years ago. Now we're working on the low battery. And we're looking at building it 2.5 feet higher, because the city's taken a look about 50 years. And at 50 years, most of the predictions kind of say you can expect 1.5 to 2.5 feet of sea level rise. When you get beyond that point, it diverges greatly, up to as much as 6 or 7 feet of sea level rise. But we think 50 years is a good place to start right now. And then the drainage projects we're doing, as you build these fortifications around the city, you have to be able to get the stormwater that falls from the sky out, and you have to be able to keep the seawater out of the drainage system. So the drainage systems that we're putting in place right now are going to be key in allowing us to continue this hardening, as I would say, of the edge of the city. And you know, fixing drainage problems they're difficult and complex projects, and they're very costly projects. So like the Calhoun East Bay project was a $15 million project. The project we're working on Highway 17, Septima Clark Parkway, is a $154 million project. So, and then the Market Street project was a $30 million project, and $6 million in a Burns Down, which is a residential neighborhood, West Ashley, that was built around the 1940s. So these things take a long time to implement. We just need, we need to make sure that when we're doing these things that we are thinking about sea level rise in the future. You asked about dealing with people, and I think what we have to show is that we do have a commitment. We have to make priorities. We have to take into consideration changing demographics and development plans and things like that, and really we have to relate it to the people, because the people have to pay for these projects. I think there were a number of years ago, but I think with the king tide flooding that we had in Charleston last year, it was a real eye-opener, and it made believers out of people that might not have been. We try to stay away from the discussion of what's causing climate change and just say, let's look at the reality and let's look at what the records show us. And if you look on NOAA's website, they've got documentation from the early 1900s that show that the tide has risen in Charleston a little over a foot every 100 years. And we expect that to at least be the baseline of what will happen. But just in seeing the number of flood days, so non-rain days, when we just have tides that seem to flood the streets, it's gone from 2 days a year in the 1970s and is expected to be, it's gone up every year and is expected to be much greater than that, as many as 38 or more days a year. So I think people are really beginning to accept that there is things changing. And people that live on the shore and live along the marsh, they're seeing it too. I think water creeping up higher into people's backyards that have low backyards, kind of the things. James Island's kind of unique. It's kind of got a series of creeks that run through it. It's also got a very high bluff on the Morris Island side. So, we got elevations on James Island that won't be as affected by much, but it'll be the same thing. The king tide that happened last October actually flooded Harborview Road, and I've lived there for 27 years and never seen Harborview Road topped before. Well, I think to some extent it's kind of why we're seeing so much area affected by sea level rise. More than 50% of the peninsula is fill, and like I said earlier, it's those areas that were filled just enough to get a building built upon them that are the areas that we're now having to go back and retrofit with these very large drainage systems that we're putting in. And when I say large systems, we're using a series of tunnels and pump stations, tunnel diameters that range from 6 feet to 12 feet in diameter, 140 feet below ground, that can snake through the city so that we can get stormwater down into those tunnels and then pump it back out. There are, and there's an area, West Ashley in the Shadow Moss neighborhood, where we've invested, I think, $2.8 million, I believe, maybe $3.2 million. And in the October floods, there was 32 townhome units that flooded, several single-family home units in that same area. And we do not have an engineering solution that will allow us to lower that flood elevation in that area. So we're working with FEMA through a flood mitigation assistance grant, and we're actually proposing to buy those homes out. That land will be raised and be green space forever. It's crucial because I'd say more than 50% of our projects end up being funded by grants, either through the state or the federal government. The city's invested a significant amount of money ourselves to be ready to apply for those grants, but without those grants we wouldn't be building or fixing the drainage on Highway 17 and September Clark Parkway and over near Burke High School and around the Medical University. So it's really important, and working with the Corps of Engineers is also very important. When we're dealing with sea level rise and drainage in the City of Charleston, we're looking at a multitude of tools, everything from the engineering solutions to building more sustainable buildings and having buildings being built higher in the city. And like I said, to the point of where we just can't fix things to buying houses out.